Hey bud, how often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Leave it to you to hop on a trend years after everyone else has moved on. Well, my name is Latin, so how often do you think?
Given your ambiguously historical origins, tendency toward corporate imperialism, and deep simmering predisposition for petty revenge, I'd say you think about it a lot, maybe even most days.
Whatever helps you get this video off the ground, bud.
Oh yeah, speaking of the video, today we're all going to be thinking about the Roman Empire because we've got a mega fun journey through the highlights of Roman rhetorical history in store. In the last video in this series, we visited ancient Greece and talked about rhetoric's origins alongside Greek democracy and the tensions, at least in philosophers' minds, between philosophy and rhetoric. By the time Rome rolled around, rhetoric's place in the world wasn't really up for debate. Even by the 1st century BCE, Bizel and Herzberg note, instruction in rhetoric had become a regular feature of the education of upper-class young men. Instruction in precepts was accompanied by composition of the progymnasmata and by declamation of practice speeches. See, so if you're not following along with the progymnasmata series on the show, let this be your reminder that you're missing out on the same fun that students were having since the year -100. But of course, Rome was not Greece, so while rhetoric played a role in Rome, that role was a little different. Like in Greece, one of the major theaters of rhetorical practice in the Roman Republic was the courts, but as George Kennedy points out, an important difference between Greek and Roman courts was that in Greece, litigants had ordinarily been expected to speak on their own behalf, and the teaching of judicial rhetoric assumed this situation. At Rome, by the time of the later Republic, most members of the upper classes may have been able to speak in court, but they regularly got their more eloquent friends to help them. In practice, major cases were pleaded by professional orators. So where Greek rhetoricians made a name for themselves as speechwriters, many of the great Roman rhetoricians made a name for themselves as orators in the courts, not just writing speeches for others to give, but giving speeches on behalf of others. Success in the courts was a pathway to prestige, influence, and even political power. In fact, the first significant and oldest complete treatise in rhetoric that we have in Latin is the Rhetorica ad Herennium, or the Rhetoric to Herennius, a treatise composed by an unknown author that's presented as the wisdom of an experienced public speaker, a full explanation of the art of rhetoric and the ins and outs of oratory, delivered for the benefit of someone more or less starting out. As the author puts it in the very beginning, "Yet your desire, Gaius Herennius, has spurred me to compose a work on the theory of public speaking." So, like Aristotle's rhetoric, the Ad Herennium provides a full overview of the art. But where Aristotle's rhetoric is the product of a more scholarly approach, the Ad Herennium reads more like a professional guidebook. Aristotle is concerned with defining the art of rhetoric and accounting for the theoretically available means of persuasion, while the Rhetorica ad Herennium is full of advice about omitting your introduction if your adversary has worn your audience out by being too wordy, or using pauses effectively to reset the voice and give hearers time to think. Aristotle's rhetoric is good for understanding rhetoric in theory, but while the Ad Herennium does offer some useful theory, it is, true to its stated purpose, a practical manual. As such, the work is organized around the process of composing and giving speeches. Its first 2 books are focused on how speakers develop the content of their speeches, by doing things like considering the fundamental nature of a legal dispute, for example, whether it be a question of fact, what really happened, a legal issue, how does the law apply, a juridical question, we know what happened, but is it right or wrong, a matter of shifting guilt, I did do it, but it was only because someone else drove me to it, or others. Additionally, the speaker should work through proofs and refutations that they'll use to draw the audience to the proper conclusion, as well as considering things such as the defendant's motives, manner of life, place and time of the alleged event, and so on. All of these pieces, all of the background work of building the case and creating the substance of the argument, falls under the label of invention. From there, the Ad Herennium shifts its attention in Book 3 to arrangement, the guidelines for organizing an argument into a compelling and effective structure, including suggestions for good introductions and conclusions. Delivery, the guidelines for actually speaking in an engaging and persuasive way, including controlling vocal volume, stability, and flexibility. And memory, the guidelines for memorizing a speech, including by imagining a physical location like a house and mapping key images onto it. The 4th and final book focuses on style, and the author divides style into 3 types. The grand style, which involves ornate words and figures of thought and diction with grandeur. The middle style, in which the author writes, we have relaxed our style, and yet have not descended to the most ordinary prose. And the simple style, which is closest to everyday speech. Each type of style serves a different purpose, and the author points out that any style should be guided by taste, correctness, and clarity. For example, some mistake what he calls a swollen style for the grand, so that to those who are inexperienced, turgid and inflated language often seems majestic. When a thought is expressed either in new or in archaic words, or in clumsy metaphors, or in diction more impressive than the theme demands, most of those, he says, who fall into this type, straying from the type they began with, are misled by the appearance of grandeur and cannot perceive the tumidity of the style. Long story short, the Rhetorica ad Herennium is a practical guide built around 5 tasks or departments of rhetoric, and these 5 eventually came to be known as the 5 traditional canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, delivery, memory, and style. If you want to give a good speech, you begin by building the raw material of your argument, fitting it into an effective structure, practicing good vocal control and physical presence, memorizing your composition, and polishing your presentation with a suitably varied, tasteful, and clear style. And our modern rhetorical practice puts less pressure on some aspects of rhetoric, like memorization, but we can see the influence of the canon even in the modern college writing class, which puts a lot of emphasis on research, analysis, and idea generation, invention, on outlining and planning, arrangement, on document design and revision, or delivery, and on clear, rhetorically appropriate language, style. But anyway, the ad Herennium was so complete and authoritative that until the Renaissance, it was attributed to Cicero, the greatest Roman orator and the next stop on our trip. Traditionally, the Rhetorica ad Herennium was attributed to Cicero because it was so similar to On Invention, a work he wrote as an adolescent and that may have been meant as a series that dealt with each of the 5 canons. Now, whether he never completed it or it was lost, On Invention is all we have now, and it shows us that Cicero was studying rhetoric and thinking seriously about it even at a young age. But Cicero made his career in the courts, gaining renown as a peerless orator and eventually finding his way to the highest levels of Roman Republican government, serving in 63 as consul. And of course, we're more interested in an overview of major rhetorical ideas from the Romans, not an exhaustive discussion of Roman history and government. We are talking about a period of roughly 1,000 years after all. So let's just leave it at the fact that Cicero was about as big a deal as big deals get, and it was, in large part, thanks to his rhetorical prowess. As Kennedy notes, however, Cicero's political challenge throughout his career, and thus the focus of much of his rhetoric, was how to preserve the Roman Republic and the society in which he grew up from revolutionary threats fostered by the ambitions of demagogues, administrative corruption, foreign and civil war, and economic chaos. He was a political moderate, ambitious for personal honor and influence within the traditions of the Roman Republic, but well aware of the many economic, social, and administrative problems of his time. In other words, Cicero was a champion of the Republic at a time when that Republic was being transformed into an empire. And as a result, Cicero was at times engaged in highly public oratory, and at others, he was retired to contemplation, even exile for a year, where rather than make political and legal arguments, he wrote treatises on rhetoric, one of which was On the Orator, which he wrote in 55 BCE. On the Orator is a dialogue, kind of like Plato's, which primarily sees Crassus and Antonius discussing the role and training of the orator. In the words of Bezel and Herzberg, the patrician Crassus, who had been consul and who had instructed young Cicero in rhetoric, promotes excellence in oratory by uniting broad learning and the study of both rhetoric and philosophy. The other principal discussant, Antonius, argues that natural eloquence, the most important qualification for excellence, can profit from instruction only in a more narrowly conceived formulaic rhetoric. In the beginning, Cicero points out that truly excellent orators are rare, because excellence in oratory demands a deep familiarity with all fields of knowledge, arguing that achieving greatness in oratory requires more than just learning some rules or methods provided by teachers. Then, in the dialogue, Crassus announces the fundamental value of oratory like this. In every free nation, and most of all in communities which have attained the enjoyment of peace and tranquility, this one art has always flourished above the rest and ever reigned supreme. Who, therefore, would not rightly admire this faculty and deem it his duty to exert himself to the utmost in this field, that by so doing he may surpass men themselves in that particular respect wherein chiefly men are superior to animals? To come, however, at length to the highest achievements of eloquence, what other power could have been strong enough, either to gather scattered humanity into one place, or to lead it out of its brutish existence in the wilderness up to our present condition of civilization as men and as citizens? Rhetoric, eloquence, and oratory is not just the fruit of free society, but the foundation of civilization. As such, in Cicero's dialogue, rhetoric holds a preeminent place among the arts. As he writes, your natural sciences itself, your mathematics, and other studies which just now you reckoned as belonging peculiarly to the rest of the arts, do indeed pertain to the knowledge of their professors. Yet if anyone should wish by speaking to put these same arts in their full light, it is to oratorical skill that he must run for help. As such, the orator's training must be wide-ranging and multidisciplinary. From there, the debate hinges on Antonius's claims that eloquence comes from natural ability, while Crassus argues that orators can be trained. They then discuss style, arrangement, persuasion, and other aspects of oratorical excellence and training. Unlike Plato, who wrote the dialogue Gorgias as a skeptic of rhetoric, or Aristotle, who wrote his Rhetoric as a philosopher examining the art, Cicero wrote On the Orator as an unparalleled practitioner of rhetoric. Bezel and Herzberg write his prose style attracted admiration from his own to the present day. It is a style characterized by amplification and heightened emotion. Cicero also argued that the skillful rhetorician should vary his style depending on the effect he wants to produce. Plain for exposition, middle for engaging attention, and high or grand for arousing noble emotion. And Kennedy describes Cicero's rhetorical skill like this. Although he had a high opinion of himself and could at times be pompous, he also had a splendid sense of humor, and above all, he had a gift for eloquent spoken and written expression that has rarely been approached since. Indeed, as Kennedy writes, Cicero's influence on rhetoric as both a practitioner and authority on theory are so significant that it is not an overstatement to say that the history of rhetoric in Western Europe from his time to at least the 17th century is the history of Ciceronianism. However, since he was not just a scholar of rhetoric, but a prominent politician, Cicero did find himself swept up in the tumultuous politics of his day. During the conflicts following the assassination of Julius Caesar, as Bezel and Herzberg write, Cicero attacked Mark Antony because he seemed the next most likely candidate for tyrant. Cicero supported Caesar Octavian in hopes that the mild young man would leave governing to the Senate, but Cicero had lost his audience, or more accurately, the prevailing political violence had destroyed any audience for rhetoric. When Antony and Octavian allied, temporarily as it turned out, Octavian agreed to Antony's demand that Cicero be killed. In 43 BCE, the old man was stabbed in his litter as he was fleeing the country, so the story goes, and his hands and head, which had written and spoken so powerfully, were nailed to the rostrum, the main public speaker's platform in Rome, which was usually decorated with trophies of war.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, but you don't have any hands.
Well, not here. They were smart enough to separate us. Just imagine what I could do if I had my hands. Well, I guess imagining is all we can do. Too bad about that Cicero, though. You get too good at stuff and people just don't like it. Then you take shots at a lesser despot, and that's that.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
I know.
Gee, thanks. Well, with the rise of Octavian as Caesar Augustus, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, and naturally, rhetorical practice contracted significantly as deference to the empire replaced freedom of expression and deliberation. Kennedy explains that, of course, there were less opportunities for political rhetoric under the empire, and that the courts became more professionalized, more focused on legal procedure than rhetorical skill. But because formal education almost exclusively stressed verbal skills, the Roman public was left with all kinds of rhetorical ability and nowhere to use it. As a result, the practice of declamation became really popular. Originally, declamation was something that happened in schools. Students would be given a topic that they would have to compose and deliver a speech on. Different students would argue different sides of the issue, but the idea was not to debate. Usually, the goal was not to pick a winner, but just to showcase rhetorical skill. Under the early empire, declamation migrated from the schools to become a more widespread form of entertainment. Spend much time reading about the declaimers, and you'll probably run into the word excess. Declamations were fantastical speeches, stuffed with the showboatiest style and the most outrageous content. Sometimes that excess provided some literary cover for expressing ideas that would have otherwise been dangerous to express in imperial Rome, But declamation was a form of entertainment, and it got just as extravagant as you might expect speeches as content to get. In some ways, perhaps, the excesses of declamation mirrored the excesses of imperial society. And when Vespasian became emperor, Kennedy notes, he began a program for reform of government and society in reaction to the decadence and corruption of Nero. One feature of it was the appointment of Quintilian to a chair in rhetoric supported by the state treasury, the first such appointment ever made. Quintilian, like Cicero, got his start in the courts, but Quintilian rose in prominence not as an orator and politician, but as an educator. Quintilian held Cicero as the greatest example of eloquence, and because he resisted the decadence and excesses of declamation, preferring a more practical and grounded approach to rhetoric, he earned Vespasian's favor and became a prominent teacher.
Well, you would be prominent if the emperor was paying your way. All you have to do is play nice with autocrats.
Well, maybe so. Historians have criticized Quintilian for flattering the emperor and tolerating abuses of power, but at least among historians of rhetoric, you could hardly find a more consistent focus of admiration. We know Quintilian best from the sprawling treatise on education that he wrote at the end of his career, the Institutes of Oratory, a full-scale program of education from the beginning of an orator's life to the beginning of that orator's career. As Kennedy writes, Quintilian emerges from his work as a humane, likable, and in many ways admirable man. He was a professional educator with high standards, patience, and respect for his students. He had a sense of humor and combined the authority of his position with personal modesty. His lofty cultural vision of the ideal orator, something he thought still possible in Rome, is tempered with a realistic sense of what individuals could achieve and the times demanded. And Bezel and Herzberg add to the praise, writing, Quintilian compares the teacher-student relationship to one between a loving father and a devoted son, all the more poignant in that his own two sons predeceased him. Thus, the teacher would inspire love of learning, not fear of punishment. Quintilian believes in adapting instruction to age and ability and eschewing pettifogging controversies over rhetorical classifications in favor of teachable syntheses. Quintilian feels he must answer charges that the ideal he seeks is impossible for mortals to achieve, that such a good man will be hard to find. Quintilian's answer is that he will make one. Quintilian's insistence on the moral element may bespeak his own quiet desperation about what sort of leader would be needed to galvanize the corrupt Rome of his day. Quintilian, as we know him from his writings, appears to be a thoughtful, humane, and you could even say surprisingly modern teacher in some ways, and he approaches rhetoric with a sincere morality. He might be best known for his definition of rhetoric, the good man speaking well, which highlights the way his program for training speakers also involved a deep focus on morality and character. Not only would he say that rhetoric should be practiced according to high moral standards, but he would probably go so far as to say that rhetoric practiced immorally isn't really rhetoric at all. But we could talk all day about Quintilian.
Please, no.
Let me finish. We could talk all day about Quintilian, but why not hear from the man himself?
That's not really better.
Oh, yes it is. Spend some time with Quintilian and you'll end up liking him too. I'll make sure of it.
That sounds a lot like a threat, bud.
Only if you don't like the result. But let's start with his approach to teaching. Quintilian writes that a teacher should adopt then, above all things, the feelings of a parent toward his pupils, and consider that he succeeds to the place of those by whom the children were entrusted to him. Let him neither have vices in himself nor tolerate them in others. Let his austerity not be stern, nor his affability too easy, lest dislike arise from the one or contempt from the other. Let him discourse frequently on what is honorable and good, for the oftener he admonishes, the more seldom he will have to chastise. Let him not be of an angry temper, and yet not a conniver at what ought to be corrected. Let him be plain in his mode of teaching and patient of labor, but rather diligent in exacting tasks than fond of giving them of excessive length. In amending what requires correction, let him not be harsh, and least of all not reproachful. For that very circumstances that some tutors blame as if they hated deters many young men from their proposed course of study. And we know his ideas have caught on because none of us have had teachers who gave us overly long assignments and busy work, none have made us feel bad to the point of giving up on a subject or major, and never in the history of the world since Quintilian has a teacher given harsh, unhelpful correction. Never. Quintilian argues that education should be matched to a child's developmental stage. He argues that teachers who cannot or will not teach the little things are not, as they might think, very good teachers. But the eloquent professor must also be a man of sense, as any fast walker, if he should happen to walk with a child, would give him his hand, relax his pace, and not go on quicker than his companion could follow. Maybe here we could point out that scholars have criticized Quintilian for not contributing to the theory of rhetoric. In all the institutes of oratory, Quintilian does not say anything new about rhetoric the way Aristotle does, and he does not advance the practice of rhetoric the way Cicero did. But can I just ask something really quick? What is it with scholars? What's the deal? Imagine dedicating your life to teaching, writing an exhaustive 12-volume curriculum influencing generations of thinkers that followed, and then having a bunch of scholars in the 19th century and later turn up their nose at you because you didn't add anything new to the conversation. Well, you know what they say. Those who can't do teach, and those who can't teach sit in endowed chairs at prestigious universities and write articles no one will read about how Quintilian wasn't that great because he was merely a teacher. But I'm getting distracted. Remember how everyone in ancient Greece was fighting over whether rhetoric was an art or whether it was good or bad or useful for anything? Quintilian is aware of this debate and the idea that rhetoric is suspect because bad people have done bad things with it. Under such a mode of reasoning, he writes, we must reject food, for it has often given rise to ill health. We must never go under roofs, for they sometimes fall upon those who dwell beneath them. A sword must not be forged for a soldier, for a robber may use the same weapon. Who does not know that fire and water, without which life cannot exist, and that I may not confine myself to things of earth, that the sun and moon, the chief of the celestial luminaries, sometimes produce hurtful effects? But, he concludes, if eloquence be the art of speaking well, the definition which I adopt, so that a true orator must be above all a good man, it must assuredly be acknowledged that it is a useful art. Quintilian also frames the tension between rhetoric and philosophy like this. As to the objection which some make that it is the business of philosophy to discourse of what is good, useful, and just, it makes nothing against me. For when they say a philosopher, they mean a good man, and why then should I be surprised that an orator, whom I consider to be also a good man, should discourse upon the same subjects? Especially when I have shown in the preceding book that philosophers have taken possession of this province because it was abandoned by the orators, a province which had always belonged to oratory, so that the philosophers are rather trespassing upon our ground. It's not the rhetoricians who are peddling a counterfeit of philosophy, it's the philosophers trespassing on the domain of rhetoric and acting like they made it up. I mean, how can you not like Quintilian? Not only is he a thoughtful and humane teacher and a thorough commentator on rhetoric, he's a funny one, too.
Oh, and to think I almost ended up on his bookshelf. But no, I get stuck here.
Oh, you love it and you know it. But, like always, there's so much we could say and think about and do, but maybe we'll let Bezel and Herzberg have the final word on Quintilian, because he was not just teaching rhetoric because he didn't know what else to do. As they put it, it seems that for Quintilian, we must have rhetoric to save the world. The good man speaking well is almost messianic. Lofty though that aspiration may be, Quintilian's Institutes of Oratory make it clear that he was committed to training just such world-saving orators, even in a time of autocratic imperial authority. But even though we've really only chipped a little off the tip of the Roman iceberg, we have talked about a lot. So let's see where Rome's rhetorical developments have brought us before we call it a day. Well, a lot of Greek rhetoric that we looked at in the last video was invested in trying to figure out what rhetoric was and what it was good for. That had become a much less important question by the time we get to Rome. Rhetoric was the heart and foundation of education, and it permeated the political system of the Republic. As a result, in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, the works of Cicero, and even the works of Quintilian, we see treatments of rhetoric that come from and look towards practical applications of rhetoric. So we don't see, for example, Plato's hand-wringing about whether rhetoric can be a way to discover truth. Instead, it's simply the way business is done in Rome, and the objective is to show practitioners how to make good use of it in their careers. The standardization of rhetorical education and practice also marked Roman rhetoric. Whether we're dealing with the articulation of the composing process as expressed in the 5 canons of rhetoric, or the standardization of education as expressed in the Progymnasmata, it's further evident that where the Greeks were figuring out what rhetoric was, the Romans were figuring out how to make the most efficient use of it. But even then, the Roman treatises remain fully aware of rhetoric's unique capacity for flexibility and adaptability. While the texts we've looked at today all provide exhaustive programs for using rhetoric, they also mention the importance of setting the rules aside should the situation call for it. But Rome's practical rhetoricians were not without their ideals either. Cicero employed his rhetorical skill in a fated effort to preserve a failing republic, and identified rhetoric as something inextricably connected to free society. Later, Quintilian taught a version of rhetoric that demanded moral excellence and sought to pull an empire out of decadence. While rhetoric was, to an extent, stifled and sometimes warped under the empire, it persisted at the heart of liberal education and flourished wherever freedom of thought and expression were permitted. And despite centuries of imperial rule, the ideals of both Cicero and Quintilian proved deeply influential, inflecting the course of European thought and oratory for centuries past the empire's fall. Which is all to say, in other words, that our story of rhetoric's history is really only just getting started. So thank you so much for joining me today on this brief survey of Roman rhetoric, and come back soon for plenty more.